You know those Christmas dinners that unfold in the heart of a Midwestern suburb like ours in Chicago, where the table groans under the weight of a golden roasted turkey surrounded by steaming bowls of mashed potatoes flecked with gravy, crisp green beans mixed with bacon bits, and that obligatory cranberry sauce that always tastes more tart than festive, all lit by the soft glow of candles flickering against the backdrop of a snow-dusted window overlooking the quiet street where neighbors' lights twinkle like distant stars, but beneath the surface of all that forced warmth simmers a tension thicker than the fog rolling off Lake Michigan on a winter night. The kind of tension that has been building for years in my family without anyone daring to name it until it finally erupts like a long overdue storm. Well, that was exactly the scene playing out in our old bungalow 2 Christmases ago, when Elena Ramirez, a 45-year-old accountant who had spent the better part of the last decade balancing spreadsheets at a downtown firm by day, and then coming home to manage the endless demands of raising my sharp-witted 16-year-old daughter Sophia on my own by night, found myself seated at my parents' dining table once again, pretending that the invisible threads of obligation and resentment weren't pulling tighter with every passing holiday season. My father, Jack, a gruff 68-year-old retiree who had spent 35 years welding parts on the assembly line at the auto plant before his back gave out and forced him into a life of idle complaints and half-hearted attempts at fixing things around the house, sat at the head of the table, his calloused hands gripping a fork as if it were a tool he could use to hammer out his frustrations, while my mother, Linda, 65 and still clinging to her routines of baking pies that never quite rose right and attending bridge club meetings where she swapped gossip about the neighbors, fluttered around the edges of the room, her apron dusted with flour and her voice trailing off into apologies that never quite landed on the real issue at hand. I had driven over from my modest apartment in the city with Sophia in tow, the car's heater blasting against the biting cold as we navigated the icy roads lined with houses decked out in multicolored lights and inflatable Santas waving mechanically in the front yards, chatting lightly about her latest school drama club performance, where she had landed the lead in a play about teenage rebellion that now felt ironically prophetic, all while I pushed down the familiar knot in my stomach that always formed whenever we crossed the threshold into my parents' home, a place that should have felt like a sanctuary, but instead resembled a ledger of unpaid debts and unspoken expectations. For years, I had been the quiet pillar holding everything together, ever since my no-good ex-husband skipped town 8 years back, leaving me with a pile of his gambling debts and a toddler who needed stability more than I needed sleep. And in the midst of that chaos, my parents' retirement savings had dwindled faster than expected due to Dad's string of bad investments in stocks he swore were sure things and Mom's habit of dipping into their accounts for little luxuries like new curtains or a weekend trip to the casino that never paid off. So I stepped in without fanfare, wiring money from my own paycheck to cover their mortgage payments that were creeping up with property taxes, balancing their checkbook over late-night phone calls to make sure the utilities stayed on, and even co-signing loans for things like Dad's rusty old pickup truck that he insisted on driving despite the constant breakdowns, all because family was supposed to mean you didn't keep score. Or at least that's what I told myself as I skipped my own vacations and settled for generic store-brand coffee to make the numbers work each month. The evening had started deceptively normal, with Sophia's excited chatter filling the air as she described the handmade ornaments she had crafted for the tree, her enthusiasm a bright spot amid the dimming light outside where the first flurries of snow began to swirl against the panes, and Mom passing around the rolls warm from the oven while Dad grunted approvals at the Bears' slim chance of making the playoffs. But as the meal progressed and the plates filled with seconds that no one seemed hungry enough to eat, I noticed the way Dad's gaze kept drifting to the sideboard where his worn leather wallet sat like an accusation, his jaw tightening with each sip of the watered-down eggnog that Mom had spiked just enough to take the edge off, but not enough to loosen tongues. Conversation had meandered from Sophia's upcoming winter formal dance, where she hoped to convince me to let her borrow my old pearl necklace that had been a gift from my grandmother, to my recent promotion at the firm. That came with a modest raise, but also longer hours crunching numbers for clients who treated taxes like a game they could cheat, and, through it all, I smiled and nodded, ignoring the undercurrent of ingratitude that had been bubbling for months in the form of offhand comments from Dad about how kids these days don't know the value of $1. Even as I quietly paid off the credit card balance he had racked up on fishing gear and sports memorabilia that gathered dust in the garage. It was in those moments, as the radio in the background crooned Bing Crosby's velvety rendition of White Christmas, with its promises of snowy evenings and joyful reunions, that I felt the first real crack in the facade. A subtle shift in the air that made the candle flames dance erratically and the silverware clink a little too sharply against the china plates. Then, without warning, as if the weight of all those unspoken burdens had finally tipped the scale, Dad set his glass down with a thud that reverberated through the room like the first rumble of thunder. His face contorting into a mask of barely contained anger weathered by decades of factory shifts and unfulfilled dreams, and he fixed his eyes on me with a stare that cut deeper than any argument we had ever had before. "Elena," he declared, his voice gravelly and low, slicing through the sudden silence that fell over the table like a heavy blanket smothering the holiday cheer, "you've been nothing but a burden on this family for far too long. Draining us dry with your endless needs and your so-called sacrifices that feel more like chains. We don't want you here anymore. Not like this." The words hung in the air, sharp and final, turning the warmth of the dining room into a chill that seeped into my bones, Sophia's fork pausing midway to her mouth as her wide eyes darted between us, and Mom's hands twisting the napkin in her lap until her knuckles turned white. But I sat there frozen, the gravy from my untouched portion cooling on my plate, a bitter laugh threatening to escape, because after all the checks I had written in the dead of night, after the promotions I had turned down to be available for their emergencies, after the pieces of my own life I had patched together with duct tape and determination to keep theirs from falling apart, this was the thanks I got delivered. Over a meal meant for togetherness. In that suspended moment, as the snow continued to fall silently outside and the radio droned on with its oblivious melody, I met Dad's gaze and saw not just spite, but a flicker of something deeper, perhaps fear or regret buried under layers of pride. And though humor tried to bubble up in the absurdity of it all, what a perfectly timed load of festive nonsense, it lodged in my throat like a dry biscuit, replaced by a quiet resolve that this declaration wasn't the end of our story, but the beginning of mine rewriting the rules. What none of them realized, as I slowly pushed back my chair with a scrape that echoed like the turning of a key in a long-locked door, was that I had been keeping meticulous records in a digital folder on my laptop. Every transaction logged with dates and amounts that painted a picture far different from the one Dad had just sketched, and as my phone vibrated softly in my pocket with a bank alert reminding me of the autopay I had scheduled for their latest bill, I couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for the reality to sink in, for his hands to start trembling not from the cold draft slipping under the door, but from the sudden weight of standing on their own. The awkward shuffle of clearing the table after Dad's declaration felt like navigating a minefield disguised as a holiday cleanup, with plates clattering against the sink in rhythms that matched the pounding of my heart, while Sophia darted glances at me over stacks of half-eaten turkey and congealing gravy. Her usual teenage bravado softened into something protective and unsure as she whispered questions about whether we should just leave right then and there without finishing the pie that Mom kept pushing forward like it could sweeten the bitterness hanging in the air, and all the while I nodded mechanically, stacking silverware that suddenly seemed too heavy for my hands, my mind replaying the scene on an endless loop of disbelief and rising indignation, because how could the man who had once hoisted me onto his shoulders at county fairs now label me a burden after I had poured so much of my life into keeping their world from crumbling under the weight of medical bills and rising costs that hit retirees hardest in places like our Chicago neighborhood, where pensions stretched thin like old elastic. We lingered through the motions out of some ingrained sense of decorum, Mom murmuring apologies in that fluttering voice of hers that always trailed off into vagueness, avoiding eye contact as she wiped down the counters with more vigor than necessary, while Dad retreated to his recliner in the living room, flipping on the television to some old Western rerun where cowboys settled scores with drawn guns. A not-so-subtle parallel that made humor twist in my chest like a wry observation on our own family showdown, though the laugh stayed trapped because the sting of his words lingered too fresh, too raw, cutting through the scent of pine from the tree and the faint cinnamon from the cooling desserts that no one touched. Driving home through the snow-slicked streets that Christmas night, the car's wipers slapping rhythmically against the flurries that blurred the holiday lights into hazy orbs of red and green. Sophia and I fell into a heavy silence broken only by her eventual outburst from the passenger seat where she hugged her knees up despite the seatbelt, declaring with all the fire of her 16 years that Grandpa was way off base and that I deserved a medal instead of an eviction notice from the family table, her words warming me more than the heater struggling against the chill seeping through the vents, and I reached over to squeeze her hand, explaining in the calmest tone I could muster how this wasn't the first time resentment had bubbled up in subtle ways like Dad's offhand gripes about my city lifestyle, even as my direct deposits kept their fridge stocked and their cable bill paid. Going back to those early days after my divorce, when I had juggled night shifts at the firm to cover Sophia's daycare while slipping envelopes of cash under their door for the property taxes that Dad swore he could handle but never quite did, all without a single thank you that felt genuine, just nods and grunts that left me feeling more like an ATM than a daughter. That night, as we pulled into our apartment building with its faded brick facade and the neighbor's dog barking from the window above, I tucked Sophia into bed with promises that we'd talk more in the morning. But sleep evaded me as I sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of tea gone cold, staring at the stack of statements I'd printed out months earlier, each one a testament to the sacrifices that had become my invisible routine. Forgoing that long-dreamed-of trip to the Grand Canyon so Mom could get her hip checked without copays eating into their savings, or dipping into my emergency fund to fix the roof after a storm that Dad blamed on shoddy workmanship but wouldn't pay for himself, and in the quiet hours, uncertainty crept in, like the draft from the old windows, making me wonder if this blow-up was just the holiday blues amplified by eggnog or if they had been harboring this grudge for longer. Perhaps whispering about it during their evening walks around the block where the houses all looked the same, sturdy, but strained under the weight of middle-class dreams deferred. Christmas morning dawned with a barrage of texts lighting up my phone before the coffee even brewed, Mom's messages a flurry of emojis I ignored and pleas to come back over for the gift exchange under the tree that she had trimmed with our childhood ornaments. The ones shaped like stars and bells that now felt like relics from a time when family gatherings didn't end in ultimatums, and though part of me ached to bundle Sophia up and drive back for the sake of tradition, the wrapping paper crinkling and the surprise of mismatched socks or books that sparked joy, another fiercer part, the one that had been simmering under layers of patience, began methodically packing a suitcase in the bedroom, folding blouses and jeans with deliberate care while Sophia watched from the doorway, her backpack slung over one shoulder as if ready for our own escape, asking if this meant we were really cutting ties or just taking a breather from the drama that had tainted what should have been a magical day. I explained it simply, pulling her into the plan as I zipped compartments and tucked in toiletries, telling her how I intended to call the bank first thing to shift that joint credit card account, the one I'd added them to years ago for supposed emergencies like Dad's sudden urge to buy a new mower or Mom's impulse purchases at the craft store, so that the balance and all future charges would land squarely on their statements without my automatic payments bridging the gap, a quiet but pointed act of reclamation that felt like the first real step toward drawing a line in the snow-covered driveway of our shared history. As I reached for my phone to dial the customer service line, the screen lit up with an incoming call from Dad's number, his voice booming through the speaker when I answered despite Sophia's frantic headshake from across the room, demanding in that gruff tone edged with urgency that I get over there immediately so we could hash this out like adults instead of letting it fester into something uglier, and, before I could formulate a response laced with the wit I was mustering, something about how adults paid their own way, he added a curveball that stopped me cold, insisting I bring those financial papers I kept hidden away. The ones in my desk drawer that tracked every cent I'd funneled their way, his words implying he knew more than I'd thought possible, perhaps from snooping during one of my visits or from Mom's loose lips over bridge coffee, leaving the line humming with static as he hung up abruptly, and I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear, suitcase forgotten on the floor, heart racing at the implication that my careful records might not stay private much longer. The morning light filtering through the blinds casting long shadows that mirrored the uncertainty stretching ahead like an uncharted road slick with ice. That abrupt hang-up from Dad left the apartment feeling smaller, the walls closing in as I stared at the phone screen fading to black, while Sophia tugged at my sleeve with wide-eyed insistence that we shouldn't go back. Her voice laced with the protective worry of a teenager who had already seen too many of our family skirmishes turn into overnight standoffs. But the pull of unfinished business, mixed with a simmering curiosity about how he knew about my hidden papers, overrode her caution, prompting me to grab the laptop bag with its zipped compartment holding the printed statements and digital backups that chronicled every sacrifice from the mortgage reroutes to the emergency fund dips, all documented in neat columns that now felt like ammunition in a war I hadn't signed up for but was ready to fight with the precision of my accounting training honed over 15 years at the firm where I audited fortunes but never imagined I'd need to audit my own blood. We bundled up against the midday chill that had settled over Chicago like a stubborn fog, the streets quieter now with families tucked inside, unwrapping gifts and sipping hot cocoa, and as we drove the familiar route past the corner store where I'd bought Mom's favorite tea bags on countless visits, uncertainty gnawed at me deeper than before, wondering if this return trip would lead to some tearful reconciliation scripted like those Hallmark movies Sophia binge-watched, or if it would unravel more threads of the family tapestry, revealing stains I'd overlooked in my rush to keep everything stitched together through late nights balancing their books, while ignoring the growing stack of my own deferred dreams like that art class I'd always wanted to take or the weekend getaways with Sophia that got postponed one too many times. Pulling up to the bungalow, the driveway still dusted with fresh snow that crunched under our boots as we approached the door flanked by the same plastic wreath Mom hung every year since I was a kid. The house exuded a deceptive calm broken only by the faint hum of the television from inside, where Dad's Western rerun probably still played its predictable gunfights, and Mom answered almost immediately, her face a map of exhaustion with puffy eyes and trembling lips as she pulled me into an embrace that smelled of vanilla and defeat, whispering frantic apologies about how Dad hadn't meant it that way. How the holidays just amplified his frustrations from the doctor's visits and the fixed income that never stretched far enough despite my unseen interventions, leading us into the living room where the Christmas tree drooped slightly under its load of tinsel and lights that blinked erratically like a heartbeat out of sync. Dad sat in his recliner, the sports section crumpled on his lap but unread, his knee bouncing in that telltale rhythm of agitation as he glanced up with a mix of defiance and something softer, perhaps the flicker of regret that surfaced when his temper cooled. And we settled onto the sagging couch with Sophia perching on the arm beside me, her hand finding mine in silent solidarity while the air thickened with the scent of cooling coffee from the side table and the underlying tension that made every breath feel measured. Every word a potential landmine in this impromptu family summit that had started with an ultimatum and now teetered on the edge of revelation. I laid it out then, pulling the laptop onto my knees and opening the files with a click that echoed too loudly in the hushed space, showing them the screens of transactions scrolling like an indictment, the credit card charges for Dad's fishing rods and Mom's craft supplies, the utility transfers that kept the heat on through brutal winters, the co-signed loan for the truck that now sat rusting in the garage, and declaring in a voice steady from years of client meetings that every single bill, every debt, every obligation I'd shouldered for the past 8 years was now theirs alone to manage without my safety net, effective as of that very moment with the bank's confirmation email pinging through on my phone to underscore the finality. Watching as Dad's face hardened into a scowl that didn't quite hide the widening of his eyes and Mom's gasp that turned into a soft sob, her hands clasping together as if in prayer for the fragile peace we'd lost. Sophia shifted uncomfortably, her loyalty to me clashing with the worry lines etching her young face at the sight of Grandma's distress. But before the room could dissolve into pleas or accusations, Mom leaned forward in a twist that hit like a gut punch, confessing in a rush of words tumbling over each other that they hadn't told me about the full extent of the loan from Aunt Rosa's estate 5 years back. The one meant to help with the house repairs after the flood, but which had ballooned under hidden interest rates and was technically still tied to my name because I'd co-signed in a moment of blind trust during a family barbecue where Dad had downplayed the risks with his usual bluster about it being a sure thing, leaving me staring at her in stunned silence as the dilemma crashed over me like an unexpected wave. Did I march straight to the bank to untangle this mess and risk foreclosing on their home, the very roof I'd helped maintain, or swallow it down once more to preserve some shred of the family bond that Sophia still clung to, her squeeze on my hand a reminder that my choices rippled out to her world too? The revenge that followed was swift and satisfying in its understated cleverness, born from the quiet power of paperwork I'd always wielded better than words. As I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of getting water, but instead dialing the utility company on speakerphone just loud enough for the voices to carry back to the living room, transferring the accounts into Dad and Mom's names only with the representative's cheerful confirmation that it would reflect on their next statement, and when I returned with glasses that clinked innocently, I announced it casually over the rim of mine, watching the color drain from Dad's face as he realized the hot water, the electricity, the very basics he'd taken for granted were now a puzzle for him to solve without my invisible hand, a witty payback that felt like justice served neat without the mess of shouting matches or slammed doors. Humor flickered in my mind amid the light vulgarity of the situation. What a bunch of greenhorns. Thinking they could declare independence while riding on my dime, but it faded as Dad rose unsteadily from his chair, his argument cut short by a sudden clutch at his chest, hands shaking violently as he gripped the armrest for support. Mom rushing to his side with cries about the doctor's warnings on stress and his blood pressure meds skipped that morning, Sophia's eyes locking onto mine in panic that mirrored my own frozen uncertainty, the room spinning with the question of whether this collapse was genuine fallout from the financial shock or another layer of manipulation in our tangled family script, the ambulance sirens already wailing in the distance as neighbors peeked from curtains, leaving us all suspended in that heart-pounding limbo where truth and bluff blurred into one precarious edge. The paramedics' arrival turned the living room into a whirlwind of beeping monitors and clipped instructions, their heavy boots tracking slush from the doorstep onto the worn carpet that Mom had vacuumed just that morning, while Dad slumped in his recliner with an oxygen mask fogging up from his labored breaths, his hands still trembling as one of the medics checked his pulse and declared it a probable anxiety-induced episode rather than a full-blown heart attack, advising rest and a follow-up with the doctor, but allowing him to stay home after Mom's tearful assurances that she could monitor him through the night, all of which left me standing in the corner with arms crossed over my chest. A storm of conflicting emotions churning inside as I watched the scene unfold like a poorly directed family drama where the plot twists came too fast to process. Part of me softening at the vulnerability etched into Dad's lined face that reminded me of the times he'd bandaged my scraped knees after bike rides in the neighborhood park, yet another part hardening against the suspicion that this health scare was timed too perfectly to derail my resolve. A manipulative card played from a deck stacked with years of half-truths and shifted burdens that had worn me down like the faded paint on the bungalow siding exposed to endless Chicago winters. Sophia hovered near Mom, her teenage empathy kicking in as she fetched a blanket from the hall closet and draped it over Grandma's shoulders, but her glances back at me held a plea for guidance. Torn between the grandparents she loved for their stories of old family vacations to Lake Michigan and the mother who had become her anchor after the divorce chaos, forcing me to swallow the uncertainty that this episode might just be the universe's cruel joke, amplifying the holiday fallout into something that could bind us closer or snap the last threads holding our fractured unit together. As the medics packed up their gear and issued stern warnings about avoiding stress triggers like heated arguments over finances, the front door clicked shut behind them, leaving a heavy silence broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway that had marked every milestone from my high school graduation to Sophia's first steps. And that's when Mike, my brother, who had always positioned himself as the family's unofficial mediator, despite his track record of dodging responsibility since he moved 2 towns over after college to chase sales jobs that promised big but delivered mostly excuses, burst through the back door without knocking. His coat dusted with snow and his face set in that practiced look of concerned optimism he wore like a mask at holiday gatherings, breezing in with hugs for Mom and a clap on Dad's shoulder before turning to me with outstretched arms as if we could all just laugh this off over leftover pie. He launched into his peacemaking routine almost immediately, cornering me by the Christmas tree where the ornaments swayed gently from a draft, his voice low and conspiratorial as he suggested we put the money talk on hold for the sake of Dad's health, emphasizing family unity in that salesman patter honed from years peddling insurance policies door to door. But beneath his words I detected the undercurrent of self-interest, the way his eyes flicked nervously to his phone buzzing in his pocket. And it wasn't long before the twist unraveled, as he let slip in a moment of defensiveness that he'd been dipping into what he called the family pot for his latest business venture, a startup idea for eco-friendly car parts that sounded more like a pipe dream than a plan, revealing that those funds were actually from my transfers earmarked for their essentials, a betrayal that hit harder than Dad's dinner declaration because Mike, the brother I'd covered for during his wild college days by forging excuses to Mom, now stood exposed as another leech in the chain of dependencies I'd unwittingly enabled. The dilemma that followed coiled around me like the tinsel tangled on the lower branches, pitting my urge to confront Mike right there in front of everyone and lay bare the full extent of his siphoning, complete with screenshots from the bank app showing withdrawals timed suspiciously with his tough months against the need to shield Sophia from the uglier layers of adult greed that could taint her view of relatives she still saw through rose-colored glasses, her position on the couch now rigid, as she absorbed the fragments of conversation leaking through, her loyalty to me clashing with memories of Uncle Mike's fun gifts like the skateboard that had led to her first broken wrist and the stories he told of our childhood adventures that glossed over the fights. Mom, wiping her eyes with the hem of her sweater, caught wind of the confession and interjected with pleas for discretion, her voice cracking as she admitted the loan mess had spiraled partly because of Mike's loans from the household account, turning the room into a confessional where accusations bounced off the walls like errant ornaments, Dad muttering from his chair about ungrateful offspring while his hands fidgeted with the remote. The atmosphere thickening with the scent of cooling cocoa forgotten on the stove and the growing rift that made the once cozy space feel like a pressure cooker ready to blow. In that charged moment, as Sophia's worried gaze met mine across the divide, I weighed the cost of exposure, not just the immediate fireworks, but the long-term fallout on family ties that, frayed as they were, still anchored parts of my identity forged in this very house where I'd learned resilience from watching Dad weather plant layoffs and Mom stretch meals for 5 on a budget for 3. My revenge in response unfolded with the calculated wit of someone who had spent years turning numbers into narratives, slipping away to the guest room under the guise of checking on Sophia, but instead firing up the laptop to access the shared online banking portal, reallocating the mortgage autopay to a suspended status with a note to the lender citing discrepancies in the cosigner agreements, ensuring that come the first of the month their statements would reflect the full burden without my bridging payments. And when I re-emerged into the fray, I held up the confirmation email on my phone for all to see, announcing it with a calm that belied the satisfaction blooming inside like the first warm day after a deep freeze, declaring this as my parting gift to a family that had taken more than it gave, watching Mike's confident facade crack into stammered justifications about temporary setbacks and Dad's color drain further as the implications sank in, even Sophia managing a small, approving nod though her eyes shimmered with the conflict of seeing her uncle diminished. Light vulgarity colored the absurdity in my thoughts. What a ragtag circus of amateurs fumbling their own tightrope without a net. But the triumph was short-lived as the evening deepened into night, the snow piling higher outside, muffling the world while inside. As I helped Mom tidy the kitchen amid her subdued sniffles, my hand brushed an old wooden drawer in the sideboard that stuck slightly, revealing when pulled open a yellowed envelope addressed to me from Aunt Rosa's estate lawyer, dated years before the loan fiasco, its contents hinting at an inheritance clause. Dad's scrawled marginal notes suggested he had intercepted and redirected. A discovery that sent my pulse thundering with questions of deeper deceptions or perhaps misguided protections, the paper crinkling under my fingers as Dad's voice called from the living room demanding we settle this once and for all, the door to truth creaking. Ajar but still shrouded in the shadows of doubt that left everything hanging on the precipice of revelation. The yellowed envelope from Aunt Rosa's lawyer weighed heavier than its thin paper suggested as I slipped it into my coat pocket that night, its edges crinkling softly against the fabric while the house settled into an uneasy hush broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards under Dad's pacing footsteps in the living room and Mom's muffled sniffles from the kitchen where she busied herself with dishes that didn't need washing, leaving Sophia and me to retreat to the guest room with its lumpy mattress and faded quilt that smelled faintly of mothballs, the space feeling more like a temporary bunker than a refuge as we lay side by side staring at the water-stained ceiling, her hand finding mine in the dark as she whispered questions about whether this discovery changed everything or if it was just another layer of the family secrets we'd been peeling back like old wallpaper revealing rot underneath. And though I wanted to reassure her with certainties drawn from my accounting logic, that facts always balanced out in the end. Uncertainty twisted inside me like the wind rattling the window panes outside, where the snow had turned to a relentless blizzard blanketing Chicago in white isolation that mirrored the emotional drift, pulling us further from the bungalow's warmth. Sleep came in fits for me, haunted by visions of Aunt Rosa's stern face from family photos where she clutched her purse like a shield during holiday gatherings. Her estate, always talked about in whispers as the one pot of gold that could have eased our struggles if not for the strings attached, and by morning, when the first gray light filtered through the curtains turning the room into shades of muted blue, the weight of that letter pressed me to confront the final act of this holiday. Unraveling, a confrontation that would either forge a new path for Sophia and me or drag us back into the cycle of obligations I'd fought so hard to break, all while the distant hum of the city waking up reminded me that life outside these walls continued with its own demands, from my desk at the firm piled with year-end reports to Sophia's school deadlines that couldn't wait for family drama to resolve. Dawn brought no easing of tensions as coffee brewed too strong in the percolator, filling the air with its bitter aroma that clashed with the lingering pine from the tree now shedding needles onto the carpet like silent accusations. And Dad summoned me to the den with a gravelly call that echoed down the hall, his voice carrying the remnants of last night's scare, but laced with a renewed determination, as if the health episode had steeled him rather than softened his edges, leading me into the cramped space lined with shelves of dusty books he never read and framed photos of better days like our family picnic at the lake where laughter seemed genuine before the money worries crept in like weeds overtaking a garden. We faced off there amid the clutter of his workbench tools scattered from half-finished projects. Him settled in his worn armchair with a mug steaming in his grip, while I stood by the window overlooking the snow-covered backyard where the old swing set rusted in neglect, and he launched into a defense of the past choices, framing the hidden loan and the estate dealings as necessary family decisions made in the heat of moments when options were slim. His words tumbling out with justifications about protecting me from tax headaches or bad investments that could have sunk us all, but beneath the bluster I heard the cracks of his own regrets. The way his eyes darted to the floor when mentioning Aunt Rosa's clause that might have given me a fresh start years ago if not rerouted to shore up the house after Dad's gambling phase in the early retirement years, a revelation that twisted the knife deeper because it wasn't just greed, but a misguided paternalism that had kept me tethered, turning what should have been my inheritance into another invisible debt on my ledger. Sophia lingered in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices that seeped through the thin walls, her presence a silent jury weighing my responses as I countered with the toll of those protections. recounting the skipped art classes and postponed trips that chipped away at my dreams so theirs could stay afloat, humor edging into my tone with a wry observation about how their idea of shielding felt more like shackling, yet the dilemma loomed largest then, forcing me to choose between waving the letter like a flag of surrender to demand my full share and risk demolishing the bungalow that held our history, or walking away with partial truths, preserving some illusion of family for Sophia's sake, even as my heart hardened against the choices that had left me the perpetual fixer in a household of takers. Emotions surged in waves that pulled at the audience I imagined tuning in, those everyday folks in their 40s and 50s nursing their own sandwich generation woes over morning coffee, perhaps nodding in reluctant agreement with my stand, but disagreeing with the cold finality creeping into my voice as I prioritized our escape over mending fences. The conflict building to a peak where pity for Dad's frailty warred with the fury of betrayal, his hands gesturing animatedly but lacking the steady grip of his factory days, and in that charged standoff, Mike texted incessantly from his drive back home, his messages a barrage of excuses about the siphoned funds being loans he'd repay soon, adding fuel to the fire without the courage to face it in person, while Mom hovered outside the door wringing her apron, her passive role now exposed as complicity in the diversions that had sustained their comfort at my expense. The revenge that capped it all unfolded in measured steps, each one a clever stroke of reclamation that satisfied the building pressure without descending into chaos, starting with me pulling out my phone right there in the den on speaker mode to call the estate lawyer's office, the line connecting with a receptionist who patched me through to a partner familiar with Aunt Rosa's will, confirming over the crackle the inheritance details that the letter outlined, a modest sum earmarked specifically for me as the named beneficiary, untouched by cosigns but apparently parked in a trust Dad had influenced without authority, and as the lawyer promised to expedite the transfer citing the forged notes as grounds for review, I watched Dad's face crumple, his mug lowering slowly as the reality cascaded over him like the snow piling against the window, followed by my swift log into the remaining joint accounts to sever the final ties, routing the last of the seeded savings into a new solo fund for Sophia's college dreams, the bank's automated voice affirming each change with impersonal efficiency that underscored the finality. Every bill, every debt, yours alone now, I echoed his Christmas words with a twist that hung in the air like frost, the witty payback landing as Mom entered with wide eyes and Mike's incoming call went unanswered, Sophia stepping forward to stand beside me in quiet alliance, though her expression flickered with the sadness of fractured bonds, and even as light vulgarity flavored the scene in my mind, what a motley crew fumbling their finale without applause. The triumph felt bittersweet-laced, with the twist of Dad's partial confession that the hiding had been partly to shield me from his own failures, like the casino debts he'd buried deep, a claim that blurred lines between protection and possession, leaving me to wonder if greed or love had driven the deception, the letter now a talisman of ambiguity rather than absolution. As we gathered our things and headed for the door, the bungalow's warmth receding behind us like a chapter closing on an unfinished book, Sophia bundled in her coat, asking in a small voice if we'd ever come back for another Christmas, or if this was the new normal of just us two against the winter world. I offered no firm answer. The road ahead stretching through the plowed streets toward our apartment, where normalcy waited in the form of unpacked boxes and routine comforts, Dad's final shaky wave from the porch framed against the swirling flakes, his hands trembling one last time in the pale morning light that could signal genuine remorse or the onset of real frailty from the shocks I'd delivered, leaving the drive home filled with unanswered questions that echoed in the hum of the engine. Had I lifted a mutual burden or imposed one heavier still? Would time heal or harden the rifts? And in reclaiming my life, had I lost the family that shaped it? The ambiguity settling like fresh snow, covering old tracks, but promising uncertain paths forward where freedom tasted as sharp as the cold air rushing through the cracked window.